Hello there. Welcome to a very special episode of Electric Sheep. This is our 287 subscriber special. Excuse me. Um, yeah. Thank you very much for viewing, for subscribing. We're all in this together. So, without any further delay, this is Hurt Humans.
Hurt humans. There are words people stop using when they finally understand what those words did. Zombie. Murderer. For a long time, those words were everywhere. The sickness began small. A fever, aggression, confusion. Some people bit others during panic attacks or violent episodes. Entire cities collapsed trying to contain it. Videos spread of screaming crowds tearing each other apart in subway tunnels and apartment blocks. The infected became known as biters, crazies, rotters, the sick. But one word survived above all others. Zombie. It made things easier. A zombie was not a person. A zombie was a threat. A zombie was a target. At first, the killings were self-defense. Barricaded families fighting off foaming hordes. Police firing into charging crowds. Soldiers protecting evacuation routes while infected people clawed and screamed at checkpoints. Nobody questioned those deaths. Then fear grew larger than the sickness. The hunters appeared not long after. They called themselves the Purifiers. They wore white symbols painted over military armor and carried rifles wrapped in cloth scripture warning humanity to remain pure. Entire towns welcomed them. News stations praised them. Children drew pictures of them standing atop mountains of dead infected. The Purifiers traveled in convoys. Whenever they arrived somewhere, smoke followed. They dragged coughing people from homes before symptoms fully appeared. They burned shelters, shot survivors during sleep. Some victims were barely sick at all, just trembling, feverish, terrified. It did not matter. People saw pale skin and shaking hands and called them zombies. The Purifiers called it mercy. The infected called it murder. And both sides buried their dead in pits too large to count. Years became decades. Decades became generations. Then something unexpected happened. Human beings adapted. Some infected people learned to manage the sickness. Medicine improved. Communities formed around treatment instead of extermination. The violent episodes lessened. Children were born carrying the condition but never fully losing themselves. Others still struggled, sometimes terribly, but they were no longer mindless monsters from old propaganda films. They were simply sick. And eventually the killing stopped. Not because humanity became good, because humanity became tired. The Purifiers aged into old men and women. Their children inherited silence instead of glory. Entire archives disappeared. Monuments were removed during the night. White painted symbols were scrubbed from walls. But memory remained. The infected remembered the massacres. The hunters remembered the hordes. Every family carried ghosts. In some cities, former Purifier strongholds stood beside neighborhoods built by infected survivors. They rode the same buses, worked the same factories. Their children attended the same schools while pretending history was ancient enough to ignore. But old hatred lingered beneath the skin. Sometimes during arguments, somebody would spit the word zombie. Sometimes another would whisper murderer. The room would always fall silent afterward. Those words were poison now. Not because they were false, because they were incomplete. A zombie had once been someone's daughter, trembling in a fever while armed men kicked in her door. A murderer had once been a terrified father who watched his wife torn apart during an outbreak before joining the Purifiers to make sure it never happened again. Pain had changed them both. Pain had sharpened fear until fear became identity. One evening, nearly 2 centuries after the wars ended, an old history teacher stood before a classroom of teenagers during Remembrance Week. Half the students carried infection suppressants clipped to their belts. The other half descended from Purifier bloodlines. Nobody sat together. The teacher looked exhausted as she held an ancient photograph in trembling hands. It showed soldiers standing over a pile of corpses. Another photograph showed infected civilians ripping apart a barricade while people screamed behind it. The teacher placed both photos down. These people hated each other so much, she said quietly. No one answered. They had names for each other. Monsters, animals, demons, zombies, murderers. A student near the back muttered, "Some of them were." The teacher nodded slowly. Yes, then she looked around the room. But before all of that, they were people who were afraid, people who were grieving, people who were sick, people who lost families, lost homes, lost hope. Her tired eyes moved across every face. A simple truth took humanity generations to understand. Outside the classroom, rain struck the windows softly like distant static. The teacher spoke one final time. We were all just hurt humans.
Well, I'm sorry if that wasn't a positive story, because I do like to do mostly positive stories. But I've wanted to do something on zombies for a long time, because I really don't like zombie stories, mainly because they're depressing and bleak. So that may have been the problem with this story. But the thing is, the problem I have with zombie stories is they're meant to be like a form of entertainment, but what they can be interpreted as, to me anyways, is anti-human propaganda. Because so many people have, I've heard, discuss the hypothetical scenario of what they would do during a zombie apocalypse, and very quickly it devolves into hoarding supplies, or I would shoot this person if they got bit, or I would want someone to shoot me if I got bit. And it's a little disturbing because I mean it's so it like I understand like thought scenarios, and it's just all in fun and games and all that, but it's so quickly people um, dehumanize themselves and each other just by putting themselves in a desperate situation. But that is kind of the point of a lot of zombie stories, and I'm not trying to say those stories are bad. I'm just trying to say these are the problems I have with those stories, and I like triumph of the best of humanity rather than devolving into the worst of our instincts. But I also understand like when slurs develop, it's because there's all this trauma and background history behind things that we in the next generation may not completely comprehend, but they're just words to us. But to a previous generation or somebody who's been through so much worse, those words can be something painful. And those and people might be thinking of different words depending on what you've dealt with in your life. Um, but I just want everybody to remember that, like, we're all human, like, and I don't want it to seem like it would be so simple for people to say, "Oh, those people are sick. They need to be contained." But I lived through a pandemic, and I saw a relatively simple sickness turn a lot of people against each other over basic things like masks, because people simply didn't agree on whether or not to wear masks. Social distancing got violent when people wouldn't social distance. Guy crowded the elevator when people were trying to social distance, and so they shoved them out. But it's just so quickly things dissolve into chaos, and I hate that. And I'm not saying that's something that can be changed by just saying, "Oh, I hate that." But I wanted this story to be kind of a vocalization of a representation of the struggle that generations go through, where they start off so cut and dry, and we think we understand things maybe because of propaganda that we've seen, or mythology that we have in our culture, like our zombie movies. And if something like a zombie sickness, even remotely like a zombie sickness, came about, people would very quickly be like, "I'm gonna shoot that person in the head," and I think that's terrible, because we got to remember that those are still human beings, even if we did get brain parasites, or whatever horrible sickness would cause us to devolve in such a way. It's that saying, hurt people, you know. Um, when we're stressed or threatened or hurt, we lash out. And that's why it was hurt humans. Because sometimes even the word people isn't enough. You've got to remember that we're all humans. We're all people. We're all in this together. Alrighty. I'm Captain Canada, Joseph Arthur Roszell. I want to thank you for watching. I want to wish you all luck in the world. I love you, and I want you to remember that suicide is never, ever the answer. Peace out for now.